The man everyone in the room had been waiting for walked straight past Richard Langdon's greeting and stopped in front of Amelia. Before hundreds of astonished eyes, Jonathan Vail looked at her as though 32 years of separation had dissolved in a single moment. Only a few minutes earlier, Amelia had been standing quietly beside a floral column at the far end of the Aurora Harbor Hotel ballroom, where the crystal light fell more softly than it did elsewhere. Richard had told her to remain there while he spoke with the important guests. His tone had been gentle, polished enough that no outsider would notice, but Amelia heard the familiar message beneath every word. Do not draw attention. Do not speak too much. Do not disrupt the evening he had prepared so carefully. She had heard versions of those words for so many years that they had almost become part of the air around her. Richard never needed to raise his voice. He simply knew how to make Amelia feel as though she should step back one more pace. At parties, she was often reminded to smile just enough. In conversations, she was often interrupted with a joke that seemed harmless on the surface. In daily life, her opinions were listened to in a way that made it clear the final decision still did not belong to her. Tonight, Richard needed everything to be perfect. Langdon Properties was going through its most difficult period yet. The harborfront development he had once promoted as the symbol of his ambition had stalled. Several partners had begun to hesitate. Calls from his study lasted longer. Dinners had become shorter and quieter. Richard never told Amelia everything, but she was perceptive enough to notice the tension hidden beneath the perfectly tailored suit and the confident smile he brought with him to the gala. Jonathan Vail was the man Richard most wanted to meet that night, chairman of Vail Meridian Group, an investor known for seeing opportunity before anyone else could. A well-timed handshake with Jonathan might reopen the door that had been slowly closing on Langdon Properties. So Richard had chosen every detail of his appearance with care, from the antique watch at his wrist to the first sentence he planned to say when he met the powerful guest. Only Amelia, in his eyes, was a detail to be arranged neatly in the background. Before they left the house, Richard had studied her deep blue dress longer than necessary. It was a dress Amelia had chosen herself after days of thought, not flashy but refined. Soft lines, understated color, elegant enough for a formal evening. In the mirror, she had seen herself as composed and graceful. Richard had only remarked that it was a little too simple, then reminded her once again that discretion mattered most tonight. Amelia did not argue. She had grown too used to letting such words pass over the calm surface of her face. Only her hand moved slightly, brushing the silver maple leaf brooch pinned near her collar. That small piece did not belong to Richard's polished world. It came from a much older time, from someone she had once believed she would never see again in this lifetime. The Aurora Harbor ballroom gleamed like a painting polished to perfection. Brilliant chandeliers hung from the high ceiling. Banquet tables draped in crisp white linen were accented with orchids and scented candles. Guests moved in small clusters, discussing investments, art, real estate, winter retreats, and newly established charitable foundations. The sound of strings filled the space with a carefully measured elegance. Richard slipped into the crowd at once, as though he had spent the entire week waiting to stand precisely where he was. Amelia remained beside the floral column, holding a glass of mineral water and watching. She saw her husband shake hands with a group of businessmen, smile at exactly the right moment, lean in at just the right angle, and speak with every ounce of confidence he could summon. Yet beneath that polished composure, Richard still revealed a few tiny signs: a tightened jaw, one pass of his fingers over his cuff more than necessary, a moment when his gaze lingered on the main entrance a little too long. He was waiting for Jonathan Vail. Then the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted. The conversations near the entrance softened first. A few heads turned. Eyes quickly gathered toward the main aisle as though an invisible force had appeared there. Amelia looked up as well, and in that instant her heart stopped. Jonathan Vail walked in. He was tall, steady in his bearing, his dark hair now silvered at the temples. The charcoal suit made him stand out not because it was showy, but because of the almost absolute calm that seemed to rise from every movement he made. He did not need to seek attention. The room turned toward him on its own. People accustomed to power often carried the noise of status with them. Jonathan carried something else: certainty, depth, a presence that made those around him lower their voices without being asked. Richard stepped forward immediately. The opportunity he had been waiting for had finally arrived. He adjusted his lapel, arranged his most professional smile, and extended his hand. "Mr. Vail, it is a true honor to meet you." Jonathan turned his eyes toward Richard, but only for the briefest beat. Then his gaze drifted away. because at the far end of the room, beside the flower column washed in softer light, stood a woman in silence, her fingers lightly touching a silver maple leaf brooch. Jonathan went still. Time seemed to stop inside his eyes. He had seen that face in memory more times than he could count, on long flights, in unfamiliar hotel rooms, in late evenings after empty boardrooms had gone dark. It was the face of the girl who had once made him believe that business was not only about numbers, that power could be used to create opportunity for others. It was the face of the woman he had searched for through scattered traces for 32 years, Amelia. There was no mistake. Jonathan could still hear Richard speaking, but the sound quickly faded into the distance. All he could see was Amelia. She was not the same young woman preserved in his memory. Her face had matured. Her eyes held the added depth of years lived and endured, but the silver brooch was still there. The way she stood motionless while trying to hide what she felt was still there, and most of all, the feeling inside him remained astonishingly unchanged. He began to walk. One step, then another. Richard stopped in the middle of his introduction. The smile on his lips stiffened when he realized Jonathan was no longer focused on him. His eyes followed the direction of the most powerful guest in the ballroom and then landed on Amelia. For one moment, Richard could not understand what was happening. Amelia, whom he so often regarded as discreet to the point of being nearly unnoticed, had somehow become the center of the entire room. Why was Jonathan Vale, a man who had never needed to please anyone, walking straight toward her with the cool distance missing from his face? The conversations around the ballroom faded completely. Guests fell silent as they watched. The enormous room seemed to narrow around one small space beside the flower column. Amelia could not move. She recognized Jonathan the moment he entered, not only by his face, but by the way time inside her suddenly turned backward. A lantern-lit evening beside Rowan Lake, a voice that had once promised to build a meaningful life with her, a pair of eyes that had looked at her as though she had never been small in front of anyone. It all returned in a single breath. Jonathan stopped before her, close enough that Amelia could clearly see the emotion shining in his eyes, emotion he made no effort to hide. "Amelia," he said, her name leaving him in a low voice that was not nearly as steady as the rest of him appeared. Hearing her name on his lips tightened something in Amelia's heart. It had been so long since anyone had spoken it as though it carried a meaning of its own. Jonathan held out his hand. Amelia looked at it for one brief second, then placed hers in his. The gesture was gentle, restrained, entirely proper. But for both of them, it was the moment when 32 years of distance suddenly narrowed until there was only one touch between them. "I have been looking for you for 32 years, Jonathan said. "I never forgot you." The sentence was not loud, but in the stillness of the ballroom it carried everywhere. A few steps behind them, Richard felt something rise within him that he could not easily name. Surprise, discomfort, and a flicker of unease he tried at once to suppress. He had never imagined Amelia had a past like this, never imagined that the woman he believed he understood had once held such an important place in the heart of a man like Jonathan Vale. The crowd began to look at Amelia differently too. No longer as the woman standing quietly at the edge of the event. No longer as the elegant shadow accompanying Richard. In that moment she became the center of a story she had never sought to claim. And that was the first reversal of the night. The person considered least important in the room was, in truth, the one who carried the greatest weight in the heart of its most powerful arrival. The woman so often reminded to remain in the background was the memory Jonathan Vale had carried for more than 3 decades. Amelia did not know how to respond. Inside her a storm surged, but her face only trembled faintly. She looked at Jonathan, then briefly at Richard, who stood frozen beneath so many watching eyes. One part of her still wanted to shrink back out of habit, but another part, deeper within, had begun to lift its head. Not because of the crowd's attention, but because for the first time in many years, someone had seen her before seeing the role she occupied beside another man. That night, beneath the glowing lights of the ballroom, Amelia did not yet know what would happen next. She did not know what secrets this reunion would uncover, or which choices could no longer be postponed. But she understood one thing with absolute clarity. Some moments do not change a life all at once. They simply open a door. And once that door appears, no one can go on living as though they have never seen it. Amelia was still standing before Jonathan, her hand still resting in his, while the entire ballroom seemed to sink into an unusual hush. No one hurried to look away. No one wanted to miss what was unfolding. In a room accustomed to calculated conversations and carefully measured smiles, this moment felt too real to be mistaken for ordinary social courtesy. Jonathan looked at Amelia as though he could hardly pull his eyes away. 32 years of searching, 32 years of wondering whether he had misunderstood everything, and now he stood before her realizing that some emotions do not fade with time. They deepen, they settle into quieter places within the heart, and when they return, they do so with a force no one can convincingly hide. Amelia heard her own heartbeat more clearly than the music in the room. She wanted to say so much, yet every word seemed caught in her throat. One part of her was still the young woman from Lake Rowan, the girl who had once believed in promises made beneath the lights beside the water. The other part was the woman who had spent too many years living carefully, always weighing Richard's reaction before allowing herself even the smallest display of feeling. Then Richard stepped forward. A smile remained on his lips, but his eyes had changed. The confidence of a businessman approaching a valuable opportunity had given way to the unsettled discomfort of someone watching events slip beyond his control. "Mr. Vale," Richard said, his tone still polite, "it seems there is an interesting story tonight that I have not yet heard." Jonathan slowly released Amelia's hand, though his attention never truly left her. He understood that Richard was trying to reclaim the center of the conversation. He also understood that Amelia was standing between two worlds, one the present she had known so long it had hardened into routine, the other a past that had just unexpectedly come back to life. "There is quite a lot that deserves to be clarified," Jonathan replied, "but not in the middle of a reception like this." The corner of Richard's mouth lifted faintly. He did not like being placed outside a conversation that involved his wife. For years, Richard had grown accustomed to explaining things on Amelia's behalf when necessary, choosing topics for her in social settings, deciding what should be shared and what was better left unsaid. He called it social grace. Amelia, little by little, had learned not to object. She had lived that way for nearly 3 decades. In the early years of their marriage, Richard always appeared to be a man who knew how to arrange everything properly. He chose the house, the vacation spots, the guest lists for important occasions. He told Amelia that a stable life needed order, and because he had more experience, it was best if he handled most of the decisions. At the time, Amelia was still weary from old loss, and she thought perhaps someone as certain as Richard might help her life feel calmer. But certainty gradually became a frame that grew tighter with time. When Amelia wanted to return to work in community outreach, Richard said the timing was not right. When she wished to attend an alumni gathering, he suggested it was unnecessary. Once she proposed donating books to a local organization, and Richard advised choosing a cause that would make a stronger impression among business associates. Each time he spoke with calm composure, as though offering the most reasonable advice in the world. There were no dramatic arguments, only small doors quietly closing one after another. Amelia adapted. She learned to place her own wishes last. She learned to answer briefly at crowded dinners. She learned to glance toward Richard before adding an opinion, as though waiting for an invisible signal of permission. To outsiders, she seemed elegant, discreet, exactly the polished wife of a successful businessman. No one knew how many times beneath that quiet exterior, Amelia had wondered when she had begun to disappear. Yet tonight, Jonathan looked at her as though she had never disappeared at all, not at her dress, not at her position as Mrs. Langdon, not at her social role. He saw Amelia herself, and that unsettled Richard more than any spoken word could have. "I believe Amelia is rather surprised," Richard said, trying to pull the rhythm of the conversation back toward himself. "Perhaps we should leave early so she can rest." Amelia heard her own name, yet what followed was not truly concern. It was a decision already being made on her behalf. There had been a time when she would have nodded at once, simply because it kept everything peaceful. But this time, before habit could take over, she looked toward Jonathan. His eyes did not urge her forward. They did not demand anything. They simply waited to see what she wanted. The moment was small, yet to Amelia it felt larger than the entire ballroom. It had been a very long time since anyone had waited for her to answer for herself. Jonathan reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and took out a cream-colored business card. He quickly wrote a short line on the back, then handed it to Amelia. "When you are ready, call me," he said. "There is no hurry. But after all these years, there are things we should say to each other." Amelia accepted the card. Her fingertips brushed the edge of the paper, and a strange feeling moved through her chest. Not loud, not overwhelming. It felt more like someone had placed a key in her hand, a key she had once believed lost forever. Richard saw everything. The smile on his lips remained, but inside, his thoughts had already begun to turn rapidly. He did not know how deep the connection between Amelia and Jonathan truly ran. He did not know why the man he had been trying so hard to approach was speaking to his wife in a tone that sounded almost private. What Richard did know was that this situation did not serve him in the slightest, and Richard had always disliked anything that fell outside his plans. "We will be in touch later," he said on Amelia's behalf, inclining slightly as though to bring the meeting to an end. Jonathan did not respond to that. He simply looked at Amelia once more. No further words were spoken, but his eyes felt like a promise left open. Amelia gave the faintest nod, a very small gesture, but Jonathan understood. Then Richard led her out of the ballroom. They passed clusters of guests who were pretending to resume their conversations, though it was obvious that many still wanted to look one more time. Some had noticed that Richard had not secured the meeting he wanted. Others had begun wondering about Amelia's past, and some, in only a few brief minutes, had already started seeing her differently. No longer as a woman standing at the edge of the evening, but as someone carrying a story powerful enough to make Jonathan Vale abandon every formality in order to walk toward her. Amelia felt those glances, yet she did not feel ashamed as she once might have expected. Instead, a strange tremor passed through her, part confusion, part awakening. Perhaps she had never been without presence. Perhaps she had simply lived too long in a place where no one reminded her of it. When the hotel doors closed behind them, the cool Boston night wind swept through, stirring the edge of Amelia's coat. Richard stood waiting for the car in a silence that felt heavy. He did not confront her immediately, not in a place where outsiders could watch. But Amelia knew the ride home would not be peaceful. She knew the questions were already being arranged in Richard's mind, one by one, sharp and careful, like chess pieces set in place before a match. And yet this time, Amelia was not only thinking about how to answer in a way that would avoid displeasing him. She was thinking about the business card in her hand, about the way Jonathan had spoken her name, about the part of herself that had begun to stir after so many years beneath a layer of dust. Inside the car, Richard stared straight ahead once the door closed. The city drifted beyond the windows in long bands of light. He kept silent for the first few minutes, long enough for the air between them to thicken. At last he spoke. "You never told me you knew Jonathan Vale." Amelia looked out the window. She knew this was only the first sentence of a much longer conversation, but when she answered, her voice was calmer than even she expected. "There are many things you never asked." Richard turned to look at her. The answer was not loud. It was not sharp, yet it made him pause. Because for the first time in many years, Amelia did not immediately shrink beneath her husband's gaze. She was still sitting beside him in a luxury car gliding through the night streets, still the woman Richard believed he understood so well. But somewhere within her, a door had opened, and behind that door was not only the memory of Jonathan. There was Amelia herself, slowly finding her way back home. And to understand why a single look from Jonathan could shake her so deeply, one had to go back long before that night at the gala, to autumn in Lake Rowan, when Amelia Hart was still a young woman who believed the future could be built through perseverance, pages of books, and a heart unwilling to live superficially. That year, Amelia was 23. She arrived at Lake Rowan College with a partial scholarship, a few neatly folded outfits tucked into an old suitcase, and a determination greater than any possession she owned. Her family lived simply. Her father worked at a small machine repair shop, and her mother provided office support for a local clinic. They could not give Amelia a life of abundance, but they gave her something more important, the belief that kindness and knowledge could open new roads. Amelia studied community education. During the day, she attended classes. In the evenings, she worked at the campus library. On weekends, she helped out at a diner near the university. Her packed schedule made many people assume she was simply trying not to fall behind. But the truth was, Amelia was not studying merely for a degree. Quietly, she was building a dream. She wanted to create free reading spaces for children in underserved neighborhoods. She wanted children who had never had a study corner of their own to still be able to touch books, stories, and imagination. In the brown-covered notebook she carried everywhere, Amelia filled page after page with small ideas, from mobile library vans to weekend storytelling sessions for families. No one saw it as a real project yet. Many smiled and considered it the beautiful thinking of an idealistic student. But Amelia kept writing, kept thinking, kept believing that something good did not need immediate recognition in order to have value. Jonathan Vale met her on a rainy evening. The library was close to closing, but Amelia was still seated at the table by the window, surrounded by books, notepapers, and a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Outside, the rain drew streaks across the glass. Inside, the warm yellow light made her face stand out in the quiet room. Jonathan passed through the area after a long group discussion. He had intended to leave at once, but stopped when he saw Amelia's pen roll off the table. He bent down, picked it up, and placed it beside the open book. "Thank you," Amelia said, her eyes still caught on the passage she had been reading. Jonathan glanced at the stack of materials in front of her and asked, "Are you planning to finish all of that tonight?" Only then did Amelia look up. Her gaze was clear, direct, without the slightest attempt to impress. "If the proposal is due tomorrow, I should probably try." Jonathan let out a soft laugh, not the polite kind offered in passing, but genuine amusement at an answer that was both dry and sincere. "May I buy you a coffee?" he asked. "Consider it a reward for going to battle with an entire mountain of books." Amelia glanced back at the clock on the wall. "I do not usually spend money when I'm trying to stay focused." "I did not ask whether you wanted to spend money," Jonathan replied. "I asked whether you wanted to take a short break." That answer left Amelia silent for a beat, not because it was especially poetic, but because there was no showmanship in the way Jonathan said it. He did not see her as someone in need of help. He was simply wondering whether she might be too tired. 10 minutes later, they were sitting in the small cafe across from the library. Steam fogged the windows, and the corner of the room smelled of freshly baked cinnamon pastries. Amelia had meant to stay only briefly before returning to work, but the conversation stretched far longer than expected. Jonathan asked about her research. Amelia spoke about how reading habits could reshape a child's confidence, about how many communities did not lack talent, but lacked the environment where talent could be nurtured. At first, Jonathan listened out of courtesy, then out of curiosity, and finally because he found himself drawn into the clarity of thought in the young woman sitting before him. He was a business student, and many people already assumed he would continue the path of the Vale family. Since childhood, Jonathan had grown up around conversations about investments, deals, growth, and long-term interests. Everyone spoke to him about how to create success. Very few ever asked what that success should be used for. Amelia was the first to ask that question naturally. If an organization can build shopping centers, resorts, and office towers, why can it not build a network of opportunities for children, she said. Not everything useful needs to be glamorous. Jonathan looked at her a moment longer. That sentence stayed with him. He did not say it aloud right away, but a part of his worldview had already begun to shift. Amelia did not possess power in the sense the Vale family admired. She held no major shares, no surname capable of opening doors in finance. But she had a rarer kind of influence. She made people ask themselves whether they were using their abilities for something truly worthwhile. That was something very few people could do. After that evening, Jonathan often found reasons to appear at the library. Sometimes he brought Amelia a small pastry from the cafe, saying that anyone who worked too late should remember to eat properly. Sometimes he borrowed a book she had mentioned, then returned a few days later ready to debate the main character. At first, Amelia simply felt glad to see him. Then she began to look forward to it. Then she realized that days without Jonathan somehow felt longer than usual. Their affection grew through simple things. Walks around Rowan Lake while red maple leaves stretched across the stone path. Long talks on the library steps until the lights inside the building began to dim. Late afternoons when Jonathan waited for her shift to end, then walked her back to the dormitory through the cold wind. With him, Amelia never had to become someone else. With her, Jonathan did not need to wear the role of heir to the Vale name. They saw each other before they saw the labels the world had placed on them. Jonathan told Amelia that his family had always believed the best life was the one already planned in advance. Attend the right school, meet the right people, invest in the right fields, maintain the right image. Amelia did not criticize that. Instead, she asked him one question that kept him silent for a long time. If everything has already been decided, then what part of that life truly belongs to you? Jonathan did not answer immediately, but from then on he began speaking more about the things he wanted to choose for himself. Not only in love, but also in work, in the way he faced responsibility, in his belief that a large corporation could still pursue the public good without losing its business strength. Amelia did not know she was helping change Jonathan's future. She was only speaking honestly about what she believed. But to him, every conversation felt like another window opening. Many years later, when people praised Jonathan Vail for building Vail Meridian Foundation and launching a series of community education initiatives, no one knew that the first seed of that vision had been planted in a small cafe near the Lake Rowan Library. No one knew that the person who first awakened it was the girl many had once considered far too ordinary to enter his world of power. That was the quiet but important truth. Amelia had influence long before anyone recognized it. Her power had never come from status. It came from her ability to awaken kindness and courage in others. Their love arrived as naturally as though it had been waiting for them. One evening in late autumn, after the Lantern Festival by Rowan Lake, Jonathan stopped beneath a row of trees shedding their leaves. The water reflected soft points of light, and the breeze carried the scent of damp grass and cool evening air. He looked calmer than the nervousness he was truly holding inside. Jonathan reached into his coat pocket and took out a small box. Inside was a silver maple leaf brooch that had been kept in his family for many years. It was not overly ornate, but it was refined and elegant. He told her his mother had once loved that piece, and that he had always believed if he ever gave it to someone, it should be to the person who made him want to become a better version of himself. Amelia looked at him, her eyes shimmering in the lakeside glow. "I do not know how easy the future will be," Jonathan said, "but I know I want to build it with you. Not only a home, but a life with meaning. Will you stay beside me?" Amelia smiled before the tears could fall. "Yes," she answered, "I will." Jonathan pinned the brooch to her coat. That moment needed no grand music, no crowd. Only two young people standing beside a softly glowing lake, believing that sincerity could carry them through any trial. They did not yet know that darker stretches lay ahead. They did not know that their love would be pulled across time, clouded by misunderstanding, tested by choices shaped by circumstances beyond their control. But that night in Lake Rowan, before life turned in another direction, Amelia and Jonathan truly belonged to one another through a faith still pure and unguarded. And it was that memory, even after 32 years, that still had the power to stir them both when they met again in the ballroom of Aurora Harbor. But before that memory became something beautiful to look back on, it was once placed before a test Amelia never saw coming. After the night of their promise beside Rowan Lake, she had believed that her future with Jonathan had finally taken shape. No longer just passing words exchanged between classes, no longer a dream living only in their eyes, everything had become a promise. Amelia still remembered clearly the morning a cream-colored envelope was delivered to the faculty office. Her name was written on the front in neat, formal handwriting. Inside was only a short card. Conrad Vail wished to meet her at his office in Boston to discuss a matter concerning Jonathan's future. At first, Amelia tried to think of it positively. Perhaps Jonathan's father simply wanted to know more about the young woman his son had chosen. Perhaps he was stern but would respect Jonathan's decision once he understood her better. After all, Jonathan had said his father was a man of principle, not someone quick to display emotion. Yet as the train carried Amelia away from Lake Rowan that morning, a quiet unease traveled with her. It was not clear enough to call fear, but it would not allow her to feel truly at ease. She sat by the window, one hand resting on the small bag she had brought with her. Inside were the brown-covered notebook, a fountain pen Jonathan had given her, and the letter she had begun writing the night before. Amelia intended to give that letter to Jonathan over the weekend, during one of their walks by the lake, as they often did. The message was not yet complete, but its meaning had already become clear in her heart. She had important news to share with him, news that left her astonished, deeply moved, and aware that their lives might soon enter a new chapter even greater than either of them had planned. Amelia had told no one. Not even Jonathan knew. She wanted to choose the right moment. She wanted to see his face when he received that joy. Over the past few days, whenever she imagined that moment, a smile had risen to her lips without her even noticing. But Conrad Vail's office did not carry the atmosphere of happy news. The Vail building in Boston appeared at the end of the avenue like a commanding structure of glass and stone. Everything from the lobby to the carpets to the private elevator system to the reception area on the upper floor gave off the feeling of being carefully calculated. The space was not loudly extravagant, yet it made anyone entering lower their voice instinctively. An assistant escorted Amelia into a spacious office overlooking the city skyline. Conrad Vail stood beside the window, his back to her for a few seconds before turning to greet her with a handshake. His silver hair was neatly combed, his dark suit almost free of a single crease, and his eyes held the calm of a man accustomed to judging others within moments. "Miss Hart, thank you for coming." His tone was courteous, his smile was as well, but Amelia sensed that behind such perfect manners stood a distance not easily crossed. "Thank you for inviting me," she replied. Conrad asked her to sit. A cup of tea was placed between them. After a few brief exchanges of courtesy, he moved directly to the point. "I understand that you and Jonathan have made an important decision together." Amelia nodded softly. "Yes, we are very serious." "I believe that," Conrad said. "Jonathan is not the sort of man who acts impulsively in matters like this." The sentence sounded like praise, but the slight emphasis at the end made Amelia wait for what might follow. Conrad studied her for a moment, then continued. "My son has many admirable qualities. He is intelligent, compassionate, and lately he has begun taking a deeper interest in community-focused work. I believe part of that change comes from you." Amelia was slightly taken aback. She did not know whether to hear it as recognition or as scrutiny. "I only share what I believe." "And Jonathan appears to listen very carefully," Conrad replied. He said it slowly. Then, without allowing the silence to grow, he opened a folder resting beside his right hand. Inside were details about Amelia's academic program, her grades, her scholarship, even a summary of her part-time work. There was nothing inherently wrong with a family wanting to learn about a woman who might one day become part of it. Yet seeing her life arranged into pages before another person made Amelia's heart sink. "You are capable," Conrad said. "Your determination is admirable as well. I do not deny that." Amelia straightened her back slightly. "Thank you, but marriage to Jonathan would place you in a very different environment. Our family carries certain responsibilities, certain relationships, and certain long-term expectations. Not everyone finds themselves suited to that rhythm of life." "I do not expect everything to be easy," Amelia replied, "only that we face it together." Conrad offered the faintest smile. "That is a beautiful way to see it. But sometimes effort alone is not enough to erase fundamental differences." Amelia said nothing. He continued in the same composed voice, neither harsh nor raised. He spoke about the obligations of the Vale family, the future Jonathan had been prepared to assume, and the strategic relationship someone in his position would need to preserve. Every word was chosen so carefully that there was little to challenge directly. Conrad never insulted Amelia outright, yet the entire conversation gradually painted a picture in which she was the person who could cause Jonathan to drift from the path his family had already laid before him. That was what truly concerned Conrad. He did not see Amelia as an ordinary girl. On the contrary, he understood exactly how much influence she carried. Since falling in love with Amelia, Jonathan had begun thinking differently, asking different questions, making different choices. He no longer spoke only of growth and market share, but of social value, education funds, and long-term responsibility to the community. In Conrad's eyes, these changes were not simply signs of maturity. They were signs that the power to shape Jonathan's future was slowly slipping from the family's hands. And the source of that influence was seated right in front of him, wearing a simple coat and carrying eyes that might seem gentle, but were far from shallow. That was the twist hidden beneath the surface. Amelia had entered the room feeling she was being underestimated because of her modest background. But in truth, what made Conrad wary was not what she lacked. It was the strength of spirit she possessed, a strength powerful enough to make his son measure life by a different standard. "Jonathan values you greatly," Conrad said after a while. "That is precisely why I trust you will think carefully about what is best for both of you." Amelia heard the sentence and knew the conversation was moving toward something else. "Best for both of us in whose sense, sir?" Conrad's eyes shifted slightly. Not much, just enough for Amelia to understand that he had not expected her to ask so directly. "In the sense that causes the least disruption to both your lives. I am not sure I understand." Conrad leaned back into his chair. "I think you understand more than you are saying. Jonathan is standing at an important stage in his life, so are you. Your scholarship, your opportunity to continue your studies, the professional path you have worked hard to build, all of it requires stability. A decision made too quickly could place pressure on things that deserve the chance to grow naturally." Amelia felt her hands turn cold. His words did not take the form of force. Not a single sentence could be pointed to as clearly unreasonable. Yet they had been placed side by side like stones quietly blocking a path. He was making her understand that marriage to Jonathan would not be only a matter of love. It would bring waves strong enough to affect both of them. And Amelia, carrying within her a secret she had not yet shared, heard every sentence with far greater weight. Conrad paused, then spoke in a tone that was almost gentler. Some feelings are very beautiful when they remain within the right moment. But if people move too quickly, they may place themselves under more pressure than necessary. I hope you are thoughtful enough to consider that. Amelia looked at the cup of tea before her. The surface had gone so still that it reflected the light from the window. She knew Conrad had not made a direct demand. He did not need to. He had already allowed her to see a future filled with uncertainty if she continued forward. Jonathan might be forced into conflict with his family. She might be drawn into a world not yet ready to welcome her, and the truth she had told no one only tangled her heart further. If someone was preparing to step into motherhood, did she have the right to risk a child's future simply because she believed love could solve everything? The thought spread through Amelia like a cloud slowly covering the sun. She left not long after. Conrad saw her out with flawless courtesy. There had been no clear threat, no crude gesture, only a polished conversation arranged skillfully enough that the listener carried the heavier burden home alone. On the train back to Lake Rowan, Amelia sat by the window for a long time without opening the brown-covered notebook. The unfinished letter to Jonathan remained in her bag. She rested her hand over it but did not take it out. Everything that had just happened in Conrad Vale's office spun through her mind, every sentence, every pause, every implication that had not needed to be fully spoken. Amelia had not stopped loving Jonathan. Quite the opposite. She loved him enough to begin asking herself whether staying might be selfish, and that question would lead her toward a decision that would change both their lives. By the time the train returned to Lake Rowan, the afternoon had already begun to fade. Amelia stepped onto the platform, cold wind brushing through her hair. In the distance, the trees around the lake were beginning to change color. She stood still for a moment amid the rush of travelers, then tightened her hand around the strap of her bag. Some tragedies do not begin with a crash. They begin with a conversation far too calm, a suggestion delivered in an even voice, and a kind heart believing it is making the most loving choice for the person it treasures most. Amelia carried that thought with her all the way from the train station back to her dormitory. Night descended slowly over Lake Rowan. Beyond the window, the sky shifted from pale gray to deep blue, then sank into a darker shade of ink. In the small room, the brown-covered notebook lay open on the desk, and the unfinished letter to Jonathan was still there, but Amelia could not bring herself to pick it up. She had repeated the opening lines in her mind more times than she could count. "Jonathan, there is something I want to tell you." Those words had once been meant to introduce joyful news. News she had held close with both tenderness and anticipation. But after meeting Conrad Vale, they suddenly felt heavy. Amelia was no longer thinking only of the happiness she and Jonathan shared. She was thinking about his future, about the path of study she had fought so hard to secure, about the sweeping changes that might come if everything collided at once. She had never stopped loving Jonathan, not even for a moment. That was precisely why the choice before her felt so cruel. The next morning, Amelia sent word asking him to meet her at the small cafe across from the town square. It was the place where they had often sat together after long days of classes, where Jonathan liked to order black coffee while she chose hot tea with honey. Just imagining herself sitting there to say words that went against her own heart made her throat tighten. Jonathan arrived first. When Amelia stepped inside, he looked up immediately and smiled. It was not a showy smile, only warm enough to make someone want to believe everything would turn out all right. 2 cups were already waiting on the table, just as they had so many times before, one for him, one for her. "I thought you were still busy today," Jonathan said gently. "Is something wrong?" Amelia sat down. She placed both hands in her lap to hide the slight trembling in her fingertips. All night, she had rehearsed the sentences she needed to say, but now, facing his eyes, every carefully prepared word felt unfamiliar. "We need to talk," she said. The smile on Jonathan's lips faded. He did not interrupt. He simply looked at her closely, as though trying to understand what had changed in her face. Amelia drew in a deep breath. "I have been thinking a great deal about our future." Jonathan nodded softly. "So have I. I also wanted to talk to you about the apartment near the east side of campus. It has beautiful windows. I think you would love it." The sentence nearly made Amelia unable to continue. For a moment, the image before her became painfully vivid. A small apartment filled with books, Jonathan at a desk, Amelia by the window drafting community plans, a modest, intimate future that felt close enough to touch. Then she remembered Conrad's office, the carefully arranged words, the sense that every path ahead was covered in uncertainty. "I think we may have moved too quickly," Amelia said. Jonathan looked at her, clearly not understanding. Too quickly? I think we need to reconsider everything. Your family, the expectations placed on you, my own path as well. I do not understand, Amelia. Just a few days ago you were so happy. I still care for you, she said, and immediately felt her heart ache at having to choose a word far too small for a feeling far too large. But perhaps we have been believing that love alone would be enough. Jonathan fell silent. Concern slowly appeared in his eyes, then shifted into a confusion he could not hide. Did someone say something to you? The question came too precisely, too close to the truth, and Amelia had to lower her gaze to the tablecloth to avoid meeting his eyes. If she looked up, if she saw that sincerity for even one more second, every bit of resolve she had gathered might collapse. No, she answered. This is my own decision. Jonathan shook his head slightly. No, this does not sound like you. Amelia, if something is troubling you, tell me. We can face it together. We can face it together. Those were the words Amelia had most longed to hear. They were also the words she feared most, because she knew Jonathan would not abandon her. He would stand beside her no matter what. Yet in the turmoil of her thoughts, that very possibility felt like a danger that could shake both their futures. She placed a small box on the table. Inside was the silver maple leaf brooch Jonathan had once given her beneath the lantern light by Rowan Lake. I gave that to you, Jonathan said slowly. I know. Then why are you returning it? Amelia looked at the box, unable to meet his eyes. Because I cannot keep walking this road. Silence settled between them. Outside the window, people continued passing by as usual. A mother led a small child across the street. A bicycle glided through a rain puddle left from the night before. Life moved forward, indifferent to the moment when two hearts were quietly beginning to crack. Jonathan reached across the table, but Amelia leaned back slightly. Not because she did not want to take his hand, because she knew that if she touched it, she would no longer be able to hold on to the fragile calm she had left. Are you sure? Jonathan asked, his voice lower now. Amelia nodded. I need to hear the truth, he continued. Do you no longer want to be with me? It was the one question she could not answer honestly. If she told the truth, everything would change. If she lied, her heart would carry that wound for years to come. In the end, Amelia chose the path that hurt her more. I think we are not as right for each other as we once believed, she said. Jonathan sat motionless. He did not accuse her, he did not raise his voice. He only looked at her in silence, as though everything he had believed so firmly about love had just been pulled from his hands without a single explanation strong enough to make sense of it. I understand, he said after a while, though his voice made it clear that he understood nothing at all. Amelia rose from her chair. Her entire body felt heavier, but her feet still had to keep moving. If she stopped, she would turn back toward him. If she turned back, she would tell him everything. And if she told him everything, she feared all the things Conrad had implied would immediately become real. I am sorry, Jonathan. He looked at her for a long time. Then he spoke in a voice Amelia would carry with her for the rest of her life. I thought my future had you in it. Amelia did not answer. She simply walked out of the cafe, leaving the small bell above the door to ring behind her like a fragile final note closing a love that had once burned so brightly. In the days that followed, Jonathan still tried to see her. He sent messages through friends, left a few lines outside her dormitory door, waited in places he knew she often passed through, but Amelia avoided him, not because she had become cold, because each time she saw him from a distance, her heart weakened a little more. She feared that if she heard him call her name just once, every wall she had built would fall apart. Then, not long afterward, Amelia endured a quiet loss she could barely bring herself to name. The small hope she had once carried within her could not remain. The doctors told her that some things happened beyond human control, and that what mattered most now was for her to rest, recover, and continue living. Amelia heard them, but it took a long time before she truly understood their words. In the small dormitory room, she sat beside the window, looking toward the distant lake. On the desk lay a letter to Jonathan that had never been sent, beside the brown-covered notebook she had not opened in some time. She felt as though she had just walked through a dense fog. The love she had released in order to protect the future had slipped away from her. The hope she had not yet shared had quietly disappeared as well. Everything that had once made her believe in tomorrow seemed to retreat all at once. From then on, Amelia avoided Jonathan even more, not because he mattered less, because he mattered too much. She did not know how to stand before him without breaking into tears. She did not know how to explain that the painful choice she had made now felt meaningless inside her. She did not know how to ask for his forgiveness when she had not yet learned to forgive herself. By the end of the school year, Jonathan left Lake Rowan. He carried with him the silence of a story that had never been fully explained. Amelia remained behind with a quiet emptiness, hidden beneath strong grades and polite answers whenever friends asked how she was doing. About half a year later, Richard Langdon entered her life. He was older, steadier, always speaking with certainty and clarity. He met Amelia's family through a local support initiative, then began visiting more often. Whenever he spoke about the future, Richard made everything sound carefully considered. For someone who was exhausted and longing for a stretch of quiet, that steadiness was easy to mistake for safety. Richard proposed in simple words. He told Amelia she deserved a stable life, a home that would not leave her worrying too much, a person who could walk beside her through the years ahead. Amelia said yes, not because her heart had lit up again, but because she thought perhaps a calm life might help her forget the things too painful to remember. Perhaps time, stability, and new routines would fill the space Jonathan had left behind. But some emptiness cannot be filled by convenience. It can only be covered over, day after day, until one begins to believe it is no longer there. And then, 32 years later, in a ballroom glowing with light in Boston, Jonathan Vail called Amelia's name once more. Just once, and every layer of dust time had gathered over memory fell away. On the way home with Richard, Amelia could barely hear the sounds beyond the car windows. The city at night slid past in long streaks of light, signs and street lamps blending together like a river of silver. Beside her, Richard remained silent longer than usual, but it was not peace. It was silence held under pressure, like the sky before a storm. Amelia knew he was waiting until they were beyond the eyes of others, waiting until the front door closed behind them and the courtesies of the gala were no longer necessary. And yet, for the first time in many years, concern over Richard's reaction was not the largest thing in her mind. The largest thing was the business card resting inside the small clutch on her lap. Cream-colored paper, elegant lettering, Jonathan Vail's name printed boldly in the upper corner, a thin piece of cardstock, yet it seemed to carry the weight of an entire chapter of life that had never truly ended. Each time Amelia thought of the moment Jonathan handed it to her, she remembered his eyes. No questions, no urgency, only patience, as though he was willing to wait for her to decide for herself. That was what made her heart tremble most. Richard may not have noticed, but Amelia did. For years she had grown used to being guided on what to think, what to say, how to present herself. Those instructions were often wrapped in the appearance of reason, so convincingly that at times she had told herself perhaps he was right. But Jonathan had not stepped forward to force the past onto the present. He had simply opened a door, then allowed her to look through it on her own. The Langdon house appeared after the final turn, silent and glowing with light. Outside, the trees were trimmed to perfection, and the stone walkway lay spotless, without a single fallen leaf. Everything was orderly to the point of feeling almost emotionless. Amelia had once believed that a beautiful house could make a person feel sheltered. After nearly 3 decades of living there, she understood that it was not so. A place became a home only when one was allowed to breathe in the rhythm of one's own life. Richard stepped out of the car first, closing the door a little more firmly than usual before walking straight inside. Amelia followed at a slower pace. She had barely removed her wrap when his voice reached her from the living room. "You never told me you knew Jonathan Vail." Amelia turned. Richard stood beside the bar cabinet, his posture straight, his expression more severe than when they had left the hotel. He tried to keep his voice steady, but curiosity mixed with irritation revealed itself in the way each word landed. "It was a very long time ago," Amelia replied. "So long ago that you forgot to mention it?" "No, life simply carried me far away from that time." Richard did not answer at once. He studied her as though reassessing a painting he thought he knew, only to discover a detail he had never seen before. It unsettled him. In Richard's mind, everything that belonged to Amelia should exist within territory he understood, a past deep enough to make Jonathan Vail visibly lose composure in the middle of a crowded ballroom was beyond that territory. The conversation did not last very long. Richard asked a few more questions. Amelia answered briefly. She did not conceal the truth, but neither did she offer more than she was ready to say. In the end, Richard said he needed to make a few work-related calls, then walked into his study and closed the door behind him. Amelia remained still at the end of the hallway for a moment longer. Part of her waited for his footsteps to return, for another question, for the sharp remarks she had heard so often across the years. But nothing came. only the steady hum of the air conditioning and the faint murmur of Richard's voice on the phone behind the wooden door. She went upstairs. In the bedroom, Amelia turned on the table lamp with its soft golden glow and sat before the dressing table. The familiar room suddenly felt unfamiliar, as though it belonged to another woman. On the tabletop stood the perfume Richard had chosen for her on one of their wedding anniversaries, a closed jewelry box, and several framed family photographs positioned precisely to decorate the space. Amelia had lived in this room for so many years, yet tonight she saw it for the first time as a place holding far too many things that had never been spoken. She opened her clutch, took out Jonathan's business card, and placed it on the table. She stared at it for a long time. Then, as though drawn by a quiet current of memory, she bent down and opened the lowest drawer. Behind a few silk scarves she rarely used lay the brown-covered notebook, its edges worn with age. She touched the cover, and a familiar sensation traveled through her fingertips. That notebook had accompanied her through her days at Lake Rowan, holding ideas for community reading programs, mobile libraries, and storytelling sessions for children in underserved neighborhoods. Richard had once flipped through a few pages and smiled, saying she had a rich imagination. It had not been an outright insult, but it was enough for Amelia to understand that he saw those ideas as memories to be put away, not dreams worth continuing. Tonight, the notebook felt entirely different. Amelia opened the first page. Her younger handwriting appeared before her, rounder, quicker, full of fire. In several corners of the pages were short notes written in Jonathan's hand. He had once read her sketches with rare attentiveness, then written in the margin a line Amelia had never forgotten. These ideas deserved the chance to become real. She gently touched the sentence. In the quiet room, Amelia suddenly understood that Jonathan had not simply remembered an old love. He had once seen the truest version of her, long before life had taught her to grow silent. He had seen her intelligence, her compassion, her endurance, the qualities Richard rarely named. A feeling both warm and painful spread through her chest. The phone on the table lit up with a new notification. Amelia had intended to ignore it, but the email subject made her pause. It was from the Lake Rowan Alumni Association, carrying the monthly bulletin and an invitation to update contact information. She opened it more by instinct than intention. In the middle of the bulletin was a short feature on the Vale Meridian Foundation. Jonathan's organization had just announced an expansion of its literacy support and community library programs across several cities. The article quoted his belief that access to knowledge could change the direction of an entire life. Then, near the end, Jonathan mentioned that the earliest inspiration behind his work had come from a college conversation with a friend who made him think differently about the purpose of success. Amelia read the sentence once more, then once again. She did not need to see her name written there to know who that friend had been. The whole room seemed to grow quieter. Somewhere beyond the walls, Richard was still speaking about business, perhaps trying to recover whatever the evening had cost him. But inside this very house, another truth was slowly taking shape. Amelia had once believed that the dreams of her youth had been folded away, shut inside a drawer, and left to fade. Yet in a place she had never known, part of those dreams had lived on in Jonathan's world, growing into real projects that touched real lives. That was the reversal no one in the ballroom had fully seen. The woman considered someone who should remain quietly in the background had once planted an idea powerful enough to influence the direction of an empire. Amelia did not own a corporation. She had not entered the gala carrying obvious authority on a business card. But she had shaped the way Jonathan saw the world. That strength was not loud. It was quiet, but it was real. And perhaps it was still alive within her. Amelia set the phone down. Her hand returned to the business card. The hesitation was still there. 32 years could not be erased by a single reunion. She did not know what Jonathan wanted to hear, nor whether she was ready to tell him everything. But she knew one thing. If she remained silent, she would once again allow time to choose for her. She picked up the phone. Her finger paused over Jonathan's number. Beyond the hallway, the house rested in its familiar stillness. But inside Amelia, something new had begun to move. Not a reckless impulse, not a fleeting dream. It was the need to look directly at the truth, even if that truth could alter the course of the rest of her life. She entered the number. The screen lit up. A moment of silence. Then Amelia pressed call. The first ring sounded, and her heart tightened. The second followed, and the palm of her hand turned cold. By the next ring, the line connected. On the other end, a familiar voice spoke, deeper than before, yet still powerful enough to make time within her pause. Amelia. That single word stopped her completely, as though 32 years had folded back into a single breath. On the other end of the line, Jonathan did not rush her with questions or speak with urgency. He simply said her name in a low voice, warmer than memory, yet still carrying the same tenderness that had once made Amelia believe she was truly seen. In the quiet room, she tightened her grip on the phone. The business card still rested before her, the brown-covered notebook lay open beside it, and the old handwritten notes seemed to stand in silent witness to a moment they had been waiting for all these years. "It is me," Amelia said. "I did not know whether I should call." Jonathan let out a soft breath. Across the city, he stood beside the window of his apartment, looking out over the dark waters of Boston Harbor. Since leaving the gala, he had barely sat down. His suit was still on, his tie loosened, but his mind had refused to settle. He had imagined finding Amelia again many times. Sometimes in his mind she smiled. Sometimes she blamed him for arriving too late. Sometimes she wanted nothing to do with the past. But he had never imagined that simply hearing her voice over the phone would make him tremble. "The fact that you called tells me tonight was not a dream," Jonathan said. Amelia lowered her gaze. His words warmed her, yet they also deepened the confusion within her. She wanted to ask him countless things. Why had he appeared there? Why had he remembered her? Why had the old ideas she once shared survived in his work, as the alumni newsletter had revealed? But when the moment truly came, her first question was far simpler. "Do you have time to meet me?" Jonathan was silent for only a brief beat. "Yes, any time you want. Tomorrow, perhaps. Somewhere quiet." Yes, Amelia chose a small cafe in Beacon Hill, tucked between an old bookstore and a flower shop. It was not too noticeable, not too loud, and it did not remind one too much of elegant rooms where people spoke more through status than through the heart. Jonathan agreed at once. No further questions, no pressure. He simply told her he would be there. When the call ended, Amelia remained seated before the dressing table for a long time. Beyond the hallway, the house was silent. Richard was likely still in his study, but for the first time in many years, Amelia did not wait to see when he might call for her. She only looked at the darkened phone screen and felt something strange beginning to grow within her. Not the recklessness of an old memory. Rather, the feeling that she had been given back the right to ask questions of her own life. The following morning, Boston lay beneath a pale wash of early sunlight. Amelia chose a cream-colored coat, gathered her hair neatly at the nape of her neck, and pinned the silver maple leaf brooch near her collar. She had hesitated before doing so, not because she feared Jonathan would notice it, but because she feared how strongly she herself might be pulled into everything the brooch represented. Then Amelia thought, if she had decided to meet the truth, she should not hide the most honest part of her memory. When she came downstairs, Richard was standing beside the dining table, glancing through several documents. He looked at her a little longer than usual. "Are you going out?" "Yes, I have an appointment." Richard looked up. "With whom?" Amelia picked up her handbag. "An old friend." He said nothing more, but something shifted in his eyes, whether it was suspicion or simply discomfort at the thought of Amelia having plans he had not arranged, she could not tell. She noticed it, but she did not allow herself to stop. The door opened. Cool morning air entered the house, and Amelia walked out. The cafe in Beacon Hill had tall windows, dark wooden tables, and the faint scent of fresh pastries in the air. Amelia arrived nearly 20 minutes early. She chose a table in the innermost corner where she could see the street outside while still keeping enough privacy for a conversation not meant for passers-by. When the small bell above the door chimed, Amelia looked up at once. Jonathan stepped inside. In daylight, he seemed different from the man at the gala. Still elegant, still composed, but more approachable. There was no crowd surrounding him, no hands waiting to shake his, none of the distance that followed a man used to appearing in financial headlines. He was simply Jonathan, the man who had once sat across from her in a little cafe in Lake Rowan, listening as she spoke about books, children, and ideas that had once seemed too idealistic for serious discussion. "Thank you for coming," he said as he sat down. Amelia looked at him. "I think this meeting has been delayed for far too long." Jonathan smiled faintly, but in his eyes was a depth of feeling still searching for where to begin. "I have waited long enough not to need another careful introduction. Amelia, what happened back then?" The question was direct, but it did not make her feel cornered. Instead, it opened a space she had carried within her for 32 years. Amelia lowered her eyes to the cup of tea that had just been placed before her. A thin ribbon of steam rose from it, blurring the view in front of her for a moment. Then she began to speak. She told him about the letter from Conrad Vale, about the train ride to Boston, about the upper floor office with its wide glass windows and the carefully chosen words that were almost impossible to challenge. She explained that Conrad had not shouted, had not insulted her openly, but had made her understand that a relationship with Jonathan would bring pressure upon them both. He spoke of family, of responsibility, of roads that could grow far more difficult if Jonathan chose another direction. Jonathan listened without blinking. As she continued, his expression grew quieter. He did not interrupt. He did not rush to react, but Amelia could see, layer by layer, his understanding beginning to change. For 32 years, Jonathan had wondered what he had lacked, had once believed perhaps Amelia had left because she no longer wanted that life. Now he understood that the old story had never been that simple. Amelia paused for a while, then spoke of the private hope she had been carrying at the time, a joy that had still been new, fragile, not yet shared, and then slowly shadowed by worry and uncertainty. She spoke calmly, without leaning too heavily into sorrow, yet Jonathan still felt the loss beneath every pause. He realized that Amelia had not simply made a difficult choice in confusion. She had borne a burden far too heavy on her own. "I did not know," Jonathan said softly. "I did not know you had to face all of that." Amelia looked at him. "I did not know what to do. I was too young. I was afraid that if I told you the truth, you would choose me at any cost, and both of us would step into a future filled with uncertainty. I thought silence was the way to protect you." Jonathan lowered his head for a moment. When he looked up again, his eyes were redder, but his voice remained steady. "I spent years believing you no longer trusted me. Now I understand that you trusted me too much. You believed I would give up everything for you, so you tried to stop that by leaving." Amelia did not answer. A single tear slipped quietly onto the back of her hand. Jonathan saw it, but he did not turn the moment into tragedy. He simply moved the box of tissues toward her slowly with respect. Then he told her his side. He said that after the day Amelia left, he had tried to speak with her once more. When she avoided him, he was devastated, yet still could not believe that everything had ended so simply. In the years that followed, he searched for information about her more than once, through old classmates, through scattered personal connections, through public traces that were still accessible. It was not constant at every moment, but he never truly let go of the wish to know how Amelia was living. "I never knew," Amelia said. "I also began to wonder why so many leads seemed to stop so quickly," Jonathan replied, "but I had no proof of anything. I only thought perhaps you wanted peace and did not want the past returning." A flicker of thought passed through Amelia's eyes. His words touched something unusual that she had not yet been able to name. But for now, what mattered more was that the truth had finally been placed between them, no longer covered by distance or imagination. Jonathan continued, his voice lower now. "Later, I built Vale Meridian differently from what my family once expected, partly because of what you had said. You made me believe success was not only about rising higher, but also about creating something useful once one had the means to do so." Amelia looked up. "The alumni bulletin I read last night mentioned that." Jonathan gave a faint smile. "I did not write your name because I did not know whether you would want to be mentioned. But the inspiration was always real." In that moment, Amelia understood the deepest reversal of her life. She had once been persuaded that she was too small beside people who possessed money, influence, and status. Yet in truth, she had helped shape the ideals of the man sitting across from her. Amelia was not only Jonathan's memory, she was part of the way he had chosen to live. And that had not disappeared, even though she had remained silent for so long. Jonathan looked at her with careful tenderness. "I do not know what your present life asks you to weigh, and I do not want to make anything more complicated. But if you need a place to begin again or simply someone willing to listen, I will be here." Amelia pressed her lips together softly. "I do not yet know what I want." "That is all right," Jonathan said. "But this time, do not let anyone else decide for you." The words fell lightly, yet within Amelia they echoed with depth. Throughout her adult life, she had grown too used to adjusting herself to the wishes of others. In that small cafe, Jonathan did not promise her a perfect future. He simply reminded her that any future worth having had to begin with a choice of her own. When they rose to leave, morning had turned toward noon. Sunlight spread across the stone pavement outside, causing the shop windows to glow softly. Jonathan did not keep her there too long. He only handed her another business card, this one with his private number written on the back in his own handwriting. "Whenever you want to continue this conversation, call me," he said. Amelia accepted it. This time her hand trembled far less than it had the night before. As she stepped out of the cafe, she felt she was still carrying countless questions, but she was no longer lost among them. Truth did not instantly heal every old bruise in the soul, but it gave Amelia back something she had lost long ago, the right to understand her own story correctly. Amelia carried that feeling home with her in the early afternoon, when the Boston sunlight had shifted away from the old rooftops of Beacon Hill and the road ahead seemed clearer in her mind. Meeting Jonathan had not made every confusion disappear at once. She still did not know what tomorrow would bring. She still did not know where this newly restored connection might lead, but one thing had changed with certainty. Amelia no longer looked at the past through a haze of guilt and speculation. She knew now that she had not been abandoned. She had not been forgotten. She had not been the only one who had carried that love in her heart. That truth changed the way she walked when she opened the door to the Langdon house. Not faster, not prouder, simply steadier. Richard was in the living room. He was not standing beside the bar cabinet as he had the night before, nor holding a stack of documents as he had that morning. He sat on the long sofa, a cup of coffee gone cold on the table, his gaze directed toward the garden beyond the glass doors. When Amelia entered, he turned almost immediately, proving that he had been waiting for the sound of the door for some time. "You were gone quite a while," Richard said. His voice was calm, even somewhat gentle, but Amelia had lived beside him long enough to know that this kind of composure usually appeared when Richard had far more questions forming in his mind than he was willing to say aloud. "I met an old friend," she replied. Richard studied her for a few seconds longer. "Jonathan Vale." Amelia did not avoid it. "Yes." A silence spread through the room. Outside, the leaves moved gently in the breeze. Sunlight reflected off the glass, making the room brighter but not warmer. Richard leaned back against the sofa. "I assumed as much." Amelia placed her handbag on the small table near the door and slowly removed her gloves. She did not know where this conversation would lead, but she no longer felt the need to immediately explain herself as though she needed forgiveness for having met someone. She walked to the chair across from him and sat down. "What do you want to ask?" she said. Richard lifted one brow slightly. "It seems that meeting has changed the way you answer." "Perhaps because, for the first time in a very long while, I heard the full story." He said nothing. Amelia briefly explained that Jonathan had spoken about the years after they parted, about how he had once tried to reach her, followed old connections, and wanted to know how she had been living. She did not emphasize the details in order to unsettle Richard. She simply told the truth, one sentence at a time, in a voice that remained strangely calm. But the more Richard listened, the harder his expression became to read. At last he asked, "How long did Jonathan say he tried to find you?" "For years," Amelia replied. "Not constantly, but long enough for me to understand that he never saw what happened back then as something easily left behind." Richard turned his face toward the glass doors. It was a very small gesture, but Amelia noticed he was avoiding her eyes. Something within her shifted. "You knew about that?" she asked. Richard did not answer right away. The question had come almost instinctively. But when his silence lasted longer than it should have, Amelia felt her heartbeat slow, then grow heavier. Not from fear, from the sense that another piece of the puzzle was beginning to appear where she had never thought to look. "Richard," she said again, calling his name, "you knew Jonathan had tried to find me?" He exhaled lightly, like someone forced to speak about something he had hoped to keep buried. "A few times after we were married, people asked about you. Letters came to an old address. A call came through someone who knew your family. A few messages were passed indirectly. I assumed they were connected to Jonathan." Amelia sat perfectly still. The words "letters" came to an old address, awakened a distant memory. In the early years of her marriage, there had been a few moments when her mother mentioned that someone seemed to be asking after her, though the details were vague. At the time, Amelia had assumed it was an old classmate. Once Richard had said it was probably nothing important, and the matter had drifted away. She had never pressed further. Back then, she had been trying to force herself into a new reality, trying to believe the past had gone too far to matter anymore. Now those old fragments returned with an entirely different meaning. "And what did you do?" Amelia asked, her voice quiet but clear. Richard looked at her. "I thought the best thing was to let the past remain where it belonged." The answer was not direct, but it was enough. Amelia felt something inside her turn cold. "You never told me." Richard maintained his composure. "We had only recently begun building our life together. You were trying to settle into a new chapter. I saw no benefit in pulling an old relationship back into it." "No benefit for whom?" Amelia asked. Richard frowned faintly. "For all of us." Amelia looked at him for a long moment. Throughout their years together, she had often believed Richard made choices on her behalf because he was used to taking charge, because he preferred handling matters in his own way. She had not liked it, but she had convinced herself that perhaps he believed it was reasonable. Today, for the first time, she saw another line more clearly. Richard had not only organized the present, he had once chosen which parts of her past were allowed to come near her. "If those letters had reached me," Amelia said slowly, "if those messages had been passed along, perhaps I would have known the truth sooner." Richard remained silent. "Perhaps I would have understood that I had not been forgotten," she continued. "Perhaps I would have had the chance to ask questions, to make choices, instead of living for decades inside a version of the story that was never complete." Richard sat up straighter. "Are you blaming me for preserving our marriage?" Amelia realized that he truly believed that was what he had done. In Richard's mind, he had not damaged anything. He had merely kept an established life from being disturbed. But that argument only deepened the disappointment within her, because he still did not understand that the issue was not whether Jonathan had returned. The issue was that Amelia had been denied the right to know. "I am not blaming you for wanting our marriage to remain steady," she said. "I am blaming you for believing you had the right to decide what I deserve to know." Richard's hand tightened slightly on the arm of the chair. "I gave you a good life." "A beautiful house is not a substitute for truth," Amelia said. "A stable life does not mean every important thing may be hidden away." The words left the room silent. Richard looked at the woman before him as though trying to recognize her. In his memory, Amelia often avoided difficult conversations. She tended to choose silence before a disagreement stretched too far. He had once seen that as gentleness, perhaps even as one of her virtues. Only now did he begin to understand that perhaps Amelia had never lacked conviction. Perhaps she had simply grown too tired from having to constantly defend her right to speak. And today, that tiredness was no longer enough to keep her quiet. "I used to think that if Jonathan truly mattered, he would have found a way to speak with you," Richard said after a while. "I did not realize it still meant this much." Amelia shook her head softly. "The meaning is not only in Jonathan, it is in the fact that for all these years I believed something that was not true. And you knew there was more to it, yet you let me keep believing it." Richard did not reply. He stood, walked toward the glass doors, and turned his back to her. From where Amelia sat, his shadow stretched long across the pale carpet. A man who had always known what to say suddenly had no words left. Perhaps Richard himself understood that this matter was larger than he had expected. He had assumed it was a minor detail best ignored, but to Amelia it was a part of her life that had been locked from the outside. Amelia rose to her feet. She no longer wished to continue the conversation in the old familiar loop where Richard used reason to make everything seem moderate, acceptable, and easier to dismiss. Some things should not be made smaller merely so the person responsible for them could feel more comfortable. As she walked toward the staircase, Richard called after her, "What are you going to do now?" Amelia stopped. The question came from behind her, but this time it did not sound like an instruction. It almost felt like the first genuine question Richard had asked her in a very long while. He did not know what she would do, and not knowing unsettled him. Amelia turned back to look at him. "I have not decided everything yet, but from now on, I want the important decisions in my life to begin with the truth, not with what someone else chooses to filter for me." Richard looked at her, and something crossed his face that he rarely allowed anyone to see: confusion. Amelia continued upstairs. Inside her private room, she closed the door and stood still for a moment, her hand still resting on the handle. She felt sad, not with a sudden dramatic sorrow, but with the quiet sadness of realizing that a marriage could last for so many years while two people still failed to truly respect one another's inner world. She walked to the window and looked down at the orderly garden behind the house. The scene remained exactly as it had always been, but within Amelia, everything had changed. Jonathan had returned the truth about her past. Richard, through his own admission, had shown her why the present had felt so narrow for so long. She could no longer live as though she knew nothing. And as the last light of evening withdrew from the window, Amelia understood that her next decision would not only alter the direction of the days ahead, it would be the first time in many years that she chose her future with her own voice. Amelia stood by the bedroom window for a long time, watching the garden behind the house gradually sink into the deep blue of evening. Everything outside remained as quiet as always. The shrubs were neatly trimmed. The stone walkway was spotless. The garden lights came on at precisely the right hour, casting a soft glow over the grass. This house had always known how to create the appearance of stability. But that night, Amelia realized the stability she had tried so hard to hold on to might have been only the surface of a life that had not truly belonged to her for far too long. She turned back toward the familiar room, the large bed with its pale linens, the wardrobe arranged by season, the dressing table near the window where for years she had sat before the mirror and wondered why the light in her own eyes seemed to fade more with time. Nothing in the room was chaotic, not a single object was out of place, yet that very perfection suddenly made it difficult to breathe. Amelia opened the wardrobe and took down the small suitcase from the upper shelf. Her first movement was slow, almost cautious, not because she had not decided, but because her body needed time to catch up with the choice her mind had already reached. She placed the suitcase on the bed and began selecting what she truly needed: a few simple outfits, personal documents, her passport, the scarf her mother had given her many years ago, the brown-covered notebook from her Lake Rowan days. Jonathan's business card was placed carefully into a small compartment of her handbag. She did not take much jewelry. She did not choose the expensive pieces Richard had bought for holidays and anniversaries. They were beautiful, but they had never made her feel understood. Some gifts are given to express care. Others are given to keep someone within a role already decided for them. Tonight, Amelia did not want to carry anything that belonged to that old role anymore. As she folded the last blouse, she noticed a small notebook tucked into the corner of the wardrobe. It was an old address book, and inside it was still Claire's number, her younger sister. Amelia had not called Claire often in many years, not because their bond had faded, but because distance had widened little by little after Richard's repeated remarks that Claire was too blunt, too opinionated, too eager to pull Amelia into unnecessary conversations. Back then, Amelia had chosen peace at home by gradually reducing the calls. She told herself she would reconnect when things became more convenient. But convenience had never arrived on its own. Amelia picked up her phone, found Claire's number, and hesitated briefly before pressing call. It rang only a few times before someone answered. "Amelia?" Claire's voice sounded both surprised and warm. Just hearing her name spoken that way made Amelia feel as though a thread she had thought loosened was suddenly pulled taut with life again. "Claire, I need to talk to you. Did something happen?" Amelia sat down beside the suitcase. She looked around the room, then spoke very slowly. "I think I'm going to leave Richard." There was a brief silence on the other end. Not because Claire had no idea what to say, but because it felt as though she had been waiting a very long time to hear those words. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Do you need me to come over?" Amelia lowered her head, moved by the fact that Claire's first question was not why, not what happened, but whether Amelia needed her beside her. "Not yet," she answered, "but I wanted you to know. And maybe I needed to hear a voice that would not make me doubt my own decision." Claire breathed out very softly. "Then you called the right person." Amelia let out a small laugh, though her eyes stung. The sisters talked a little longer. Amelia did not tell her everything. She only said that many things in the marriage had gradually made her lose sight of herself, and that an old truth had resurfaced, helping her see the present more clearly. Claire did not interrupt. She did not analyze on Amelia's behalf. She simply listened, then told her that whatever she chose tonight, she did not have to face this turning point alone. The call ended, but its warmth remained. Amelia realized that Richard had made the world around her smaller, not in one dramatic moment, but through countless tiny choices. Seeing one person a little less, postponing another call once more. Gradually, distance became habit. Habit became isolation, and isolation made a person believe there was nowhere left to return to beyond the door they were standing behind. But one phone call was enough to crack that illusion. Amelia had nearly zipped the suitcase shut when a knock sounded at the door. Before she could answer, Richard stepped in. He stopped at once when he saw the suitcase on the bed. "What are you doing?" His voice was not loud. Still, Amelia felt the tension settle instantly over the room. "I will be away for a while," she replied. "Away," Richard repeated, his gaze moving over the suitcase before returning to her. "You mean leaving the house?" Amelia nodded. "Yes." Richard stood still for a few seconds. Perhaps he had known this possibility existed from the moment Amelia left the living room after their conversation that afternoon. But seeing it take shape before him made it harder to preserve complete composure. "Where do you plan to go?" "Tonight, perhaps a hotel. After that, I will think things through. And Jonathan knows about this?" "I have not told him." Richard studied her as though searching for hesitation he could seize upon. But Amelia did not look away. Her calm unsettled him more than any sharp argument could have. "You are making a very large decision while emotional," Richard said. "One meeting with someone from the past cannot be reason enough to overturn an entire life." Amelia shook her head gently. "I am not leaving because of one meeting. I am leaving because of what that meeting helped me see clearly." "What you see clearly may only be a passing feeling." "No, feelings can come quickly, but truth often appears only after we have avoided it for too long." Richard walked slowly toward the window, then turned back. He chose a softer approach. He said that every marriage had difficult seasons, that many years together should not be dismissed because of a few misunderstandings, that Amelia might need rest, might need time, but should not act too quickly in the wake of an unexpected upheaval. In the past, those words might have made her pause. Richard sounded so reasonable. He always knew how to make a serious matter seem as though it were merely her sensitivity speaking too loudly. But today, Amelia was no longer listening with the same ears. "I have spent too many years calling my discomfort a phase," she said, "calling silence peace, calling the absence of the full truth something I should overlook. I do not want to keep living that way." Richard frowned faintly. "Do you understand how difficult life outside this house can be? You have not worked formally in years. You cannot simply walk out and assume everything will settle itself." His words were not entirely wrong, and precisely because they contained some truth, they had once kept Amelia in place for a very long time. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. She knew there would be much to relearn, finances to arrange, housing to sort out, work to rediscover, daily life to rebuild. But unlike years before, Amelia now understood that difficulty was not a reason to remain inside a life that made her smaller. "It may not be easy," she answered, "but a difficult road is still better than a place that makes me forget I can walk." Richard fell silent. That was the moment the mask between them slipped most clearly. Richard was not looking at an Amelia swept away by an old romance. He was looking at a woman who had spent a very long time thinking in silence, and who could no longer be easily moved by warnings disguised as safety. It made him realize that the authority he had believed firmly in his grasp had never fully belonged to him. It had existed because Amelia had once chosen to yield, and now she was choosing not to. "You will regret this," Richard said after a while, his voice lower. "I may have difficult days ahead," Amelia replied, "but I will not regret being honest with myself." She zipped the suitcase shut. The sound was small, yet in the quiet room it rang like the final period at the end of a chapter that had lasted far too long. Amelia stood, placed her handbag over her shoulder, and lowered the suitcase to the floor. As she passed Richard, she paused for a moment. "I do not want to turn this into a contest of who wins and who loses," she said. "I simply need distance so I can hear my own voice clearly, and this time I will not ignore it again." Richard did not answer. Amelia walked down the staircase, through the living room, through the grand foyer where everything still stood arranged as perfectly as though nothing had changed. But she knew the space could no longer hold her. When she opened the front door, the cool night air rushed in and Amelia drew a deeper breath. She placed the suitcase in the car, sat behind the wheel, and looked at the house through the rearview mirror. The windows, glowing gold, looked strangely unfamiliar. There had been a time when she believed her entire life would end in that place. Now it was only a part of the past, something to be looked back on with clarity, not bitterness but not self-deception either. Amelia picked up her phone. She opened her contacts and paused on Jonathan's number, but she did not call immediately. First, she sent Claire a message to say that she had left the house and was safe. Only then did she touch the other name. The line connected. Jonathan answered almost at once. Amelia could hear the concern in his breathing, even though he tried to keep his voice calm. "Are you all right?" Amelia looked towards the road ahead, lit by street lamps. This time, when she answered, the words came from the deepest and surest place within her. "I am beginning again. And this time, I want to choose where I go." On the other end of the line, Jonathan fell silent for the briefest moment, not because he did not know what to say, but because her words carried more weight than any explanation could. Amelia was not calling to ask for a ready-made escape. She was calling to say that she had just crossed the first threshold on her own 2 feet. "Where are you now?" Jonathan asked, his voice low and steady. Amelia looked at the sign of a small hotel glowing at the end of the street. "I am going to stop somewhere near the city center, just for tonight. I need a little quiet to think." "I understand," Jonathan replied. "If you want, I can meet you in the hotel lobby, not to make any decisions for you, only so you do not have to sit alone in this moment." Amelia gently closed her eyes. The way he said it softened something inside her. Jonathan did not turn her vulnerability into an opening to rush into her life. He placed the choice back in her hands, and that was precisely what made Amelia feel safe. "I want you to come," she said. The hotel stood on a quiet avenue, not lavish but warm. The main lobby had cream-upholstered chairs, soft golden lighting, and a vase of white flowers beside the reception desk. When the staff asked how long she would need the room, Amelia suddenly felt her throat tighten. Nearly 30 years of marriage, nearly 30 years inside a large house, and now the first night of her new life was beginning with only a small suitcase. Yet the truth did not make her feel ashamed. That suitcase did not symbolize loss. It symbolized the ability to leave. Amelia accepted the room key, then sat near the glass doors. Outside, cars passed beneath the streetlights. The city was still moving, vast and unfamiliar, but for the first time in a very long while, unfamiliarity did not frighten her. It felt like an open space waiting to be filled with new choices. The hotel doors opened a few minutes later. Jonathan stepped inside, wearing a dark coat, his stride still steady, though his eyes found Amelia so quickly that he could not hide what he felt. When he saw her seated beside the suitcase, his expression softened, not with pity, with emotion at the sight of a woman who had truly done the hardest thing. He approached, then stopped at a respectful distance. "Would you like to stay here or go upstairs and rest?" "Here for a little while," Amelia answered. "I think I need to talk before everything becomes too quiet." Jonathan nodded and sat in the chair across from her, not so close that she would feel surrounded, but close enough for her to know she was not alone. Amelia told him about the conversation with Richard, about how Richard had known Jonathan once tried to reach her, about the messages that had never made their way into her hands, about the sorrow of realizing that a part of her life had once been decided by someone else in silence. She did not speak with anger. Strangely, after leaving that house, Amelia no longer felt the need to win an argument against Richard. She only wanted to call things by their true names, so she would never deceive herself again. Jonathan listened with his hands folded before his knees. Every word Amelia spoke added another layer of meaning to the years behind them. He had once wondered why every path leading back to her seemed to close quietly. Now the answer appeared not like a sudden shock, but like a door opening far too late, revealing a room that had long been locked shut. "I am deeply sorry you had to carry all of that alone," Jonathan said. Amelia looked at him. "I am sorry too, but today I do not want to speak only about the years that were lost. I want to know what I can do tomorrow." That sentence brought a faint smile to Jonathan's face, not the smile of someone waiting for weakness so he could become her only support. It was the smile of a man relieved to see Amelia returning to the very essence that had once made him love her. "I have thought about that," Jonathan said, "but I only wanted to mention it when you were truly ready to hear it." He took a folder from the slim briefcase he had brought. It was not thick, it was not binding. It was simply an overview of an open position at the Vale Meridian Foundation, the community organization within his group. Jonathan placed it on the table between them, then drew his hand back so Amelia could open it only if she wished. "This role is connected to community reading programs and the development of mobile libraries," he explained. "The team already has strong operational experience, but they need someone who understands the human value behind the work, someone who does not see numbers as mere reports, but sees children, families, and the opportunities created by every decision." Amelia opened the folder. The words before her made her heart beat faster. Director of Community Programs, designing school outreach strategies, building relationships with local organizations, overseeing literacy support models for children. This was not merely a job. It felt like the pages of her brown-covered notebook rewritten in the language of reality. She read for a long time without speaking. Jonathan did not rush her. At last, Amelia asked softly, "Why me?" "Because this idea began with you," Jonathan replied. "But if it were only about memory, I would not have brought these papers. I brought them because after our conversation this morning, I knew you still possess what this role needs: empathy, vision, and the ability to make others believe that worthwhile work deserves to be carried through with care." Amelia looked at him, a feeling too complex to name rising within her. Richard had once made her believe she had been away from the working world for too long, that whatever abilities she had possessed in earlier years had become little more than traces of youth. Jonathan did not deny that she would need to relearn, update, and grow accustomed to professional rhythm again. But he did not see the years that had passed as proof that she had lost her worth. That was the greatest difference. "I have not worked formally in many years," Amelia said. "I may need time to find my footing." "Of course," Jonathan replied, "and that is entirely normal. You will have a support team, a transition period, and people who can guide you through the internal systems. What I hope is not that you walk in and immediately prove something to anyone. What I hope is that you receive a fair chance to decide whether this work is truly where you want to devote your heart." Amelia lowered her eyes to the folder once again. Inside her, the scattered pieces of past and present slowly began to fit together. The young woman who had once dreamed of community libraries at Lake Rowan, the woman who had just stepped away from a house that had held her inside too narrow a rhythm of life, and now a professional door opening before her, not as a reward for old love, but as recognition of a capability that had never disappeared. That was the most beautiful reversal of the moment. Amelia, whom others had seen as far removed from the professional world, was in truth holding the very heart of the project a large organization wanted to build. She did not need meaning bestowed upon her. She carried meaning with her into the room. "I would like to learn more," Amelia said slowly, "not because I want to hide behind you, but because I think this work is truly worth trying." Jonathan nodded, quiet joy lighting his eyes. "Tomorrow, I will introduce you to Elise Morgan. She coordinates the Foundation's operations and has a very practical perspective. You can speak with her, ask anything you want, and make your own decision." The next morning, Amelia entered the Vale Meridian headquarters with a mixture of nervousness and clarity. The glass building reflected Boston's pale blue sky, formal but not cold. Jonathan led her to the Foundation's floor, then stopped outside a small conference room. "The rest is yours to walk into," he said. "I do not want my presence to make the conversation feel less fair." Amelia looked at him with a flicker of gratitude, then stepped inside. Elise Morgan rose to greet her. The woman in her 40s had sharp but warm eyes, a polished manner, and a clear, direct way of speaking. She did not waste much time on formality. Elise moved straight to the work. She asked Amelia about her views on building reading habits within communities, how to reach families unfamiliar with support programs, and what allowed an educational initiative to sustain long-term impact. At first, Amelia answered carefully, but the more she spoke, the steadier her voice became. Ideas that had seemed asleep within her began to return with ease. She spoke about the importance of bringing books closer to children instead of waiting for children to find their way to books. She spoke about the role of parents. She spoke about how a mobile library could become a familiar meeting point in a neighborhood, not merely a place to borrow books, but a place where children felt welcomed. Elise listened closely. At times she took quick notes. At times she looked up and asked more. Gradually, the atmosphere in the room shifted. This was no longer a meeting to determine whether Amelia was suitable enough. It became a conversation between two people looking toward a real and shared purpose. When the meeting ended, Elise closed her notebook and said, "I do not think you are merely suited for this role. I think this program has been waiting for someone like you longer than we realized." Amelia was silent for a second. Then a smile appeared on her face, not timid, not guarded. A smile that had taken a very long time to return. "If the position is still open," she said, "I would like to accept it." Elise extended her hand, then welcome to the Foundation. When Amelia stepped out of the conference room, Jonathan was standing at the far end of the corridor. He did not approach at once. He simply waited for her to walk toward him on her own. She looked at him, a quiet and deep happiness lighting her eyes. "I accepted," Amelia said. Jonathan smiled. "I knew they would see what I have always known." Amelia shook her head softly, though the smile remained. "Perhaps this time, I am beginning to see it too." And in that moment, in the sunlit corridor of Vale Meridian, Amelia understood that she had not simply left an old life behind. She was stepping into a new role, a new purpose, and most importantly, a new version of herself. The first days at the Foundation passed more quickly than Amelia had expected. Each morning, she walked into the office with a feeling that was both nervous and eager, like someone who had stood outside a door for far too long and had finally been called by name into the room she once dreamed of entering. Her desk was not large, but its lamp was almost always on. Spread across it were maps of underserved neighborhoods, school files, notes for the mobile library program, and a small potted plant Elise had placed there on Amelia's first day, with a note that said, "All good things need time to take root." Amelia worked carefully. She did not try to prove herself through grand statements, but through thorough preparation for every meeting, every phone call, every proposal. When the team debated which areas should receive priority funding, Amelia urged them to look more closely at the number of young families, the distance to public libraries, and the long-term sustainability of each program. When one school hesitated because the procedures seemed too complicated, she suggested simplifying the participation process so teachers would not be burdened further. Elise saw it clearly. Amelia did not merely possess compassion. She had the ability to turn empathy into structured decisions. It was not a loud kind of strength, but once it entered a room, everything in that room seemed to function better. Jonathan saw it too. He did not involve himself directly in Amelia's daily work, but whenever he passed a conference room where she was presenting a plan, he witnessed something that made his heart go still. The woman who had once been placed at the edge of social gatherings now stood before a coordination team, her voice clear, her eyes focused, making others listen with genuine respect. Amelia had not become someone else. She had simply returned to the person she had been before life taught her to make herself smaller. But across the city, Richard Langdon did not receive that change with the same emotion. News that Amelia had officially joined the Vale Meridian Foundation reached him quickly. At first, Richard remained silent when his attorney mentioned it. Then the questions began. What position had she taken? Did she have authority to speak publicly? Would she appear before the media? How involved had Jonathan been in the hiring decision? The questions were asked in a calm voice, but beneath them was irritation searching for a way out. Richard had once believed Amelia would need him. He had believed that after a few days away from home, she would find life outside too complicated and return, so that everything could fall back into place. But the opposite happened. Amelia did not return. Instead, she found work that brought light back to her face, a new community that valued her voice, and a rhythm of life that did not revolve around Richard's permission. That unsettled him more than the emptiness of the house. 1 week later, Amelia's legal office received a formal document from Richard's side. The wording was not openly harsh, but it clearly carried pressure. Richard wanted to revisit several issues related to shared assets, public responsibility, and the family image during the period in which they were living separately. Some points were phrased vaguely enough to make a reader feel that Amelia had acted without proper consideration when she left the house. When Elise gave her a copy, Amelia read it carefully, then set it down. She did not panic the way she once imagined she might. Perhaps because after crossing the first threshold, the pressures that followed no longer carried the same weight. "He wants me to feel as though I have done something wrong," Amelia said to Jonathan at the end of that day. Jonathan looked at the document on the table, then back at her. "Do you believe that?" "No," Amelia replied, "but for many years I became used to hearing one thing often enough that I eventually began to doubt myself." "I do not want that to happen again." Jonathan nodded. "Then we will deal only with what needs to be dealt with, nothing more. We will not let the noise take away your focus." His answer steadied Amelia. He did not say he would fight in her place. He did not promise to erase every difficulty through influence alone. Jonathan understood that what Amelia needed was not another person stepping in to control her life, but someone who respected the way she wanted to move through it. In the days that followed, Amelia continued her work. She and Elise visited an elementary school in South Harbor, where the school library was open only a few sessions each week because of staffing shortages. In a small room washed with thin sunlight, low shelves held worn children's books. A group of students sat reading aloud with their teacher. One child sounded out words slowly, another hesitated, then smiled after finishing a long sentence correctly. Amelia stood in the doorway, silent. This was an image that had lived in her mind long before it became a real project. It was not flawless. It was not polished. But it was true. And to Amelia, truth had always been more valuable than glittering surfaces meant only to hide emptiness. On the drive back, Elise said that this school would be an excellent first pilot location for the mobile library vehicle. Amelia agreed, then spent the entire afternoon refining the budget proposal and the implementation timeline. She worked until the rows of desks outside her office gradually emptied. When she stood to retrieve more materials, she noticed Jonathan at the end of the hallway speaking with a man in a dark suit, calm in manner and posture. Later, Jonathan stepped into her office and made the introduction. The man was Noah Briggs, an independent legal advisor who had previously assisted the company with risk assessments during several major transactions. Noah shook Amelia's hand with respect. "I have heard a great deal about your library program. I hope I will have the chance to see it operating very soon." Amelia smiled and thanked him. Then she noticed that Jonathan's expression was more serious than usual. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Jonathan pulled out a chair and sat across from her, while Noah stood near the glass wall holding a slim file. "There is nothing we should rush to conclude," Jonathan said. But while reviewing several recent developments, Noah noticed that some records connected to Langdon properties contain a few inconsistencies. Amelia was silent. Jonathan continued with careful restraint. "They are only signs that deserve further review. Some publicly available information regarding project progress, capital structure, and related parties does not appear to align completely. Since Richard is using legal matters to apply pressure, my team wants to be certain that every response on our side is based on a full and transparent review." Amelia looked at Noah. "What does that mean?" Noah answered in a measured voice. "It means we will continue examining the documents through the proper process. If everything is in order, there will be nothing further to say. If any point requires review by the appropriate authorities, the information will be forwarded through the proper channels." No one said too much. No one rushed toward a conclusion. Still, Amelia felt the atmosphere in the room shift. Until now, Richard had always created the impression that he was the one who controlled everything, the one who understood the game better than anyone else. In his version of the world, problems belonged to other people. He was always the man standing above the disorder. And yet now, the company bearing his name had begun to attract questions that could not easily be brushed aside. Amelia did not feel pleased. She felt only a quiet sadness. If those irregularities proved real, then for years she had lived beside a man who spoke often of reputation, while perhaps building his own on a foundation less steady than he claimed. If they proved unfounded, then transparency would make that clear. Either way, what Amelia wanted most was not Richard's failure, but for the truth to be seen exactly as it was. "I do not want this to become a personal retaliation," Amelia said. Jonathan nodded at once. "Neither do I. What matters is clarity, nothing more." Noah agreed. "Any next step will follow the proper process." That answer reassured Amelia. She had left a life where truth was often bent according to the will of the stronger person. She did not want to begin a new chapter by repeating the old pattern in another form. A few days later, the first signals appeared in the local business press. They were not conclusions, only reports that certain activities connected to Langdon properties were being reviewed more closely in light of recent developments. The coverage was written in cautious language, not sensational, but enough to prompt questions in the market. Richard declined to comment in detail. His closest associates also became quieter than before. The news reached Amelia on the morning she was preparing to present the mobile library proposal before the foundation board. Elise asked whether she wanted to postpone. Amelia looked at the documents in her hands, then shook her head. "No," she said. "This work still matters today." And she walked into the meeting room. Throughout the presentation, Amelia did not allow her thoughts to drift away from the charts and the stories of the schools that needed support. She spoke about objectives, costs, long-term benefits, and methods for measuring impact. But when she reached the conclusion, her voice slowed slightly. "Some projects are built to impress," Amelia said. "Others are built to quietly change people's lives. I believe this program belongs to the second kind." The room remained silent for a few seconds. Then Elise was the first to nod. Jonathan sat farther back, his gaze deep and reflective. He understood that Amelia was not speaking only about a library vehicle. She was speaking about what she wanted to build for the rest of her life. Something real enough that it needed no glittering shell to protect it. The proposal was approved. When the meeting ended, Amelia stood beside the window at the far end of the corridor, looking down at the city moving below. Somewhere out there, Richard might be facing questions he had once believed only other people would ever have to answer. But here, Amelia had chosen a different path, not through loud confrontation, not through any desire to watch someone else fall, but by placing her energy into something useful, lasting, and sincere. Jonathan came to stand beside her. "Are you all right?" Amelia looked at the bands of sunlight stretching across the rooftops, then smiled. "I think I am learning not to let old things decide the rhythm of a new day." Jonathan said nothing more. He simply stood beside her in silence. And in that silence, Amelia understood more clearly than ever that real strength does not lie in making the world fear you. It lies in the ability to keep choosing kindness, even after passing through enough hardship to make bitterness seem easy. Amelia held on to that thought through the months that followed, as though carrying a small lamp along a new path still full of turns. Her work at the Vale Meridian Foundation gradually became part of the rhythm of her life. Each morning when she stepped into the sunlit glass building, Amelia no longer felt like a late arrival in a world that did not belong to her. She began to know every member of the team by name, remembered Elise's work habits, understood how carefully Maya prepared before meetings with schools, and realized that this place had given her more than a position. It had given her the feeling of contributing to something meaningful. The mobile library program was approved and quickly moved into its implementation phase. Amelia became involved in even the smallest details. She reviewed the shelving design and suggested lowering it further so children could reach the books more easily. She gave feedback on the reading list, emphasizing the need for bilingual books for families who used more than one language at home. She proposed that the storytelling area include soft rugs and warm lighting, so the children would feel welcomed rather than as though they had entered a formal classroom. Elise once told Jonathan that Amelia had a rare ability to notice what others overlooked, not because she was trying to stand out, but because she genuinely cared about the experience of the people who would step into those spaces. Jonathan only smiled when he heard it. He had known that for a very long time. Back in Lake Rowan, Amelia had once spent nearly an hour explaining why a shy child might choose to sit in a corner instead of joining in if a room felt too cold or impersonal. At the time, Jonathan had not fully understood how one small detail could affect human emotions so deeply. Now he saw that philosophy living in every decision she made. At the same time, the legal complications involving Richard gradually began moving along their own path. Amelia did not try to follow every minor development. Her attorney kept in regular contact, updated her when necessary, and advised her to focus on her new life. Questions surrounding Langdon properties continued to be reviewed by the appropriate parties, leaving Richard occupied with his own concerns rather than continuing to apply pressure on Amelia. Communication between both sides became shorter, more procedural, and far less emotional than before. What brought Amelia the greatest relief was not that Richard seemed less powerful. It was that she no longer allowed his actions to govern each of her days. He had once been the center of the house, of the schedule, of every conversation. Now Richard was slowly becoming part of an earlier chapter that Amelia could look back on with clarity, without denial, without making him darker than he was. Simply acknowledging that she had stayed there too long and that now she had stepped out. At the beginning of autumn, the first mobile library vehicle was completed. The launch day was so clear that the air itself seemed polished by light. The event took place at Harbor Street School, where Amelia had once visited with Elise during an early survey. The schoolyard was decorated with pale banners. Children stood in eager lines, gazing at the cream-colored vehicle parked nearby, its sides painted with pages opening like wings. When the doors opened, a gentle cheer spread across the yard. Amelia stood beside Elise, lightly gripping her notes even though she no longer needed to look at them. She had prepared her speech in advance, but when she saw the excited faces of children crowding toward the steps of the vehicle, every sentence she had planned suddenly felt much simpler. She did not speak for long. She only said that every book was a doorway and that no child should ever feel that doorway was too far beyond reach. She thanked the team, thanked the school, then paused briefly when her eyes met Jonathan's in the crowd below. He stood there quietly, looking at her with pride he made no effort to hide. In that moment, Amelia felt time open into two halves. On one side was the young woman who had once written this dream into a brown-covered notebook. On the other was the woman now standing before a crowd, watching that dream roll into the real world. She had taken a very long journey to return to what she once believed, but now that she had returned, that belief was no longer fragile as it had been in youth. It had matured with her. After the ceremony, a little girl of about 8 gently tugged Amelia's hand and asked whether the library vehicle would come back the following week. Amelia bent down, smiled, and said yes. The girl beamed as though she had just received a tremendous gift, and to Amelia that moment was worth more than every compliment ever spoken in a conference room. As the guests began to disperse, Jonathan came to stand beside her. He did not speak at once. He simply looked with her toward the library vehicle, still full of children inside. "You did it," he said. "We did it," Amelia replied. Jonathan shook his head gently. "I only helped open the path. You're the one who gave it a soul." Amelia smiled and her gaze softened. She had learned how to receive recognition without immediately brushing it aside out of embarrassment. That too was a new change. She understood now that when someone saw her value sincerely, accepting that truth was not arrogance, it was respect for what was real. Jonathan reached into his coat pocket and took out a small blue velvet box. Amelia saw it, and her breath slowed slightly. "I have kept this for a very long time," Jonathan said. When the lid opened, the silver maple leaf brooch rested quietly inside, glowing gently beneath the autumn sun. Amelia barely moved. She had seen that brooch in memory more times than she could count, yet its real presence before her still touched a place in her heart too deep for words. "I thought you no longer had it," she said. "Some things are not kept because of regret," Jonathan replied. "They are kept because we believe that one day they will find their way back to where they truly belong." Amelia looked up at him. There was no pressure in Jonathan's eyes, only steady sincerity, the same kind of devotion with which he had waited through all those long years. "I do not want the past to decide the present for us," he continued, "and I do not want you to agree to anything simply because you are moved by what has already passed. But today, after seeing you stand here, living true to what you believe, I am more certain than ever that the love I have for you is not for a memory. It is for the woman standing before me now. Amelia, do you want to walk the rest of this life with me?" The autumn breeze moved across the schoolyard, carrying the laughter of children and the scent of newly fallen leaves. Amelia looked at the silver brooch, then at the man who had loved her from youth until both of them were old enough to understand that love was not only emotion, but also respect, patience, and the choice made again each day. "Yes," she answered, "I do." Jonathan pinned the brooch to the lapel of her coat, where it rested as naturally as though it had never left. Amelia touched the silver leaf softly and felt that an old circle had closed, not to return to the beginning, but to open a new direction filled with peace. Their wedding took place the following spring in a small garden overlooking Boston Harbor. It was not elaborate, not showy, only warm and sincere. Claire sat in the front row, her eyes shining with joy. Elise helped Amelia adjust her delicate veil and whispered that she looked more radiant than on any day before. Colleagues from the foundation, a few of Jonathan's longtime friends, and those who truly cared for them were all there to witness the moment. Amelia walked down a path scattered with white petals, the silver brooch gleaming against her ivory wedding dress. Jonathan waited beneath the floral arch, his eyes never leaving her. It was not the look of a man reclaiming what he had lost, but of a man who understood that he was being entrusted with something precious and intended to cherish it with all the respect it deserved. In her vows, Amelia said that she had once believed peace meant living in a way that disturbed no one. Now she understood that true peace meant living honestly with herself and building a life with the person she loved without concealment. Jonathan replied that he would always remember love was not about keeping someone beside you through the weight of the past, but about making that person feel free to choose to stay every single day. When the ceremony ended, applause rose gently through the sunlit garden. Amelia smiled, her hand resting in Jonathan's, and for the first time in many years, she did not feel as though she were stepping into a role already written for her. She was stepping into a future she had chosen. Amelia's story reminds us that it is never too late to listen again to the voice within, to step beyond the limits that have kept us standing still for too long, and to believe that a new beginning can appear at the moment we least expect it. Some things in the past cannot be changed, but the way we choose to live from today onward remains in our own hands. If this story made you reflect on love, growth, and the courage to begin again, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Amelia made the right choice? Please like the video if you want to support more emotional stories like this one. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss future journeys of hope, healing, and second chances in life. Thank you for listening all the way to the end.